Imagine a man who managed to deceive investors, the media, and even the Federal Bureau of Investigation for years. A man who made everyone believe it was all over, while behind the scenes, he was building a secret financial empire, meticulously organized and completely hidden from the world. His name is Ryan Coleman. At first glance, he may seem like an ordinary fraudster, but his story is far more complex than any thriller movie. Disappearing money, secret accounts, shell companies, and precise plans created a financial network no one fully discovered, even after his imprisonment. Today, we will reveal the secrets of Ryan Coleman, the mind that baffled Wall Street and the FBI, diving into a world of mystery, money, and clever deception like you've never seen before. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will completely change the way you view fraud and financial intelligence. In the mid-1990s, a young American man named Ryan Coleman quietly emerged on the fringes of the financial world in New York City, the city that never sleeps and the beating heart of global finance. He was not a graduate of an elite university, nor did he come from wealth or influence. What he possessed instead was far more dangerous, a deep understanding of human greed. He began as a junior employee at a small brokerage firm near Wall Street, where he listened daily to investors obsess over fast profits, secret opportunities, and guaranteed breakout stocks. Amid the constant ringing of phones and frantic trading floors, an idea began to take shape. He did not want to be just another broker. He wanted to become the man who sold the illusion itself, wrapped in scientific language, complex algorithms, and a sophistication few would dare question. By 2001, after years of observation and quiet preparation, Ryan announced the launch of his own investment firm. He claimed it operated a revolutionary quantitative trading system powered by artificial intelligence long before AI became a household term. He branded his platform with a sleek, technical name and asserted that his proprietary algorithm could analyze millions of data points within seconds, predicting market movements with astonishing precision. Importantly, he did not promise outrageous returns. Instead, he offered steady annual gains between 12 and 18%, realistic enough to appear credible. That moderation became his greatest strength. He targeted doctors, attorneys, and mid-level business owners, individuals with substantial savings but little time to dissect complex market strategies. During the first year, he paid consistent returns using funds from new investors, and quietly, his reputation spread through exclusive circles where trust traveled by word of mouth rather than advertisements. What investors never knew was that the revolutionary algorithm did not exist. There was no automated trading system, no team of programmers, no control room filled with glowing market dashboards. There was only Ryan, his laptop, and meticulously designed spreadsheets crafted to look authentic. He had constructed a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, one dependent on a continuous flow of incoming capital to sustain payouts to earlier investors. To reinforce credibility, he hosted private seminars in luxury hotels, presenting intricate charts layered with dense financial terminology that intimidated rather than informed. He rarely lied outright. Instead, he buried partial truths beneath technical complexity. With each passing month, the balance in his personal accounts swelled, and so did his confidence. He began to believe he was smarter than everyone, even the regulators themselves. The doubts did not begin with regulators. They began with a single investor, a 50-year-old surgeon who had entrusted most of his savings to Ryan's stable, market-resistant strategy. In 2008, as the global financial crisis erupted and major institutions collapsed under the weight of the subprime mortgage meltdown, markets plunged into chaos. Historic banks fell. Indices crashed. Panic dominated headlines. Yet Ryan's reports showed steady, positive gains, almost untouched by the storm. While the Dow Jones tumbled violently, his clients' portfolios continued rising quietly by about 1% each month. At first, it seemed miraculous. But to the surgeon, the miracle felt mathematically impossible. No system in the world could remain perfectly insulated from a financial hurricane of that magnitude. The surgeon decided to withdraw his entire investment, not out of fear, but curiosity. He simply wanted proof that the liquidity described in the statements truly existed. Ryan responded calmly, reminding him of a contractual clause requiring 90 days' notice before full withdrawal. It was a small detail most investors had overlooked. After 90 days passed, only a partial transfer arrived, accompanied by a polite explanation citing temporary internal restructuring. Concern deepened into suspicion. The surgeon contacted other investors and discovered similar delays, identical explanations, and carefully worded reassurances. There was no visible crisis, only a pattern of quiet administrative obstacles that seemed too consistent to be coincidental. At this stage, no one was yet calling it fraud. Ryan had cultivated a powerful image. He donated to local charities, appeared at small economic forums as an independent expert, and maintained a polished public persona. But when the first formal complaint reached state regulators in New York, a routine review began. They requested documentation verifying the existence of his trading systems and detailed transaction records. Ryan provided organized digital files filled with polished spreadsheets and impressive graphics. On the surface, everything aligned perfectly. But that was precisely the issue. The data appeared almost too perfect, untouched by the natural randomness of real markets. As investors from multiple states became involved, the matter escalated into federal jurisdiction. Soon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation began quietly examining the case. It was not yet a formal accusation, merely discreet financial surveillance. Investigators analyzed wire transfers, tracked intermediary accounts, and cross-checked tax filings. Gradually, a troubling pattern emerged. There were no genuine market transactions reflecting the massive funds under management. Accounts received substantial deposits, then redistributed them in structured cycles to other investors. The structure was classic, yet concealed beneath a sophisticated professional facade. Ryan sensed the shift before receiving any official summons. Investors grew more demanding. Emails once filled with praise now contained pointed financial questions. He began preparing contingencies. Portions of his wealth were transferred to offshore accounts. He explored obtaining a second citizenship through foreign property investments. Yet he did not stop raising new funds. In fact, he quietly intensified his efforts. He understood that his entire structure depended on constant inflow. The moment that flow slowed, the illusion would collapse. During a private investor presentation at a luxury hotel in Boston, Ryan unveiled what he described as an even safer investment model. Unbeknownst to him, one attendee was cooperating with investigators. The objective was simple: encourage Ryan to elaborate on technical details that could later be scrutinized. Confident and articulate, he described advanced probabilistic models and adaptive trading architectures. Every word was recorded quietly, destined for forensic comparison against actual financial records. Digital forensic analysis delivered the decisive breakthrough. The performance reports submitted to regulators were not generated by live trading systems. They were manually constructed using spreadsheet software. Metadata revealed that daily trading results had sometimes been edited days after markets closed. Ryan had built a parallel digital reality, one that simulated market behavior without ever participating in it. Every profit, every calculated dip, every recovery curve was crafted deliberately. The markets he claimed to master existed only inside carefully formatted cells. Despite mounting evidence, investigators did not move immediately. An early arrest might trigger panic and destroy chances of full financial tracing. So they waited, documenting every inconsistency while Ryan's circle of trust quietly shrank. Some investors remained loyal, convinced that their financial prodigy was merely navigating temporary pressure. Once again, greed dulled skepticism. The breaking point arrived when a major investor demanded a full withdrawal exceeding $10 million. Ryan did not possess the liquidity to fulfill it. He attempted delay tactics, suggesting staggered payments, invoking unexpected audits, citing regulatory reviews. But this time the request came backed by an experienced legal team. The excuses began collapsing under formal scrutiny. In that moment, Ryan understood the game was nearing its end. The question was no longer whether he would be exposed, but when. Yet outwardly, he showed no fear. He continued wearing tailored suits, hosting meetings, and distributing monthly reports as if nothing had changed. He believed psychological control over perception mattered more than truth itself. What he did not realize was that the circle had already closed, and the next knock on his door would not be a request for clarification, but a confrontation. The confrontation did not happen in a dramatic chase or a public spectacle. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning in New York City. Ryan was preparing for what he believed would be another routine strategy meeting with nervous investors. He adjusted his tie, reviewed his talking points, and practiced the same calm tone that had carried him through years of deception. When the knock came, it was firm but controlled. 2 federal agents stood outside, composed and unmistakably official. In that instant, the illusion he had so carefully constructed began to fracture. There was no shouting, no resistance. Just a silent acknowledgement that the performance was over. The warrant was precise and overwhelming. Financial fraud. Wire fraud. Securities violations. The evidence presented was not based on suspicion but on documented financial trails, digital forensics, recorded meetings, and sworn statements. As agents escorted him out of the building, employees watched in stunned disbelief. Some had genuinely believed in the company's mission. Others had quietly suspected inconsistencies but convinced themselves that brilliance often looked unusual from the outside. Cameras did not capture the arrest, but word spread quickly through financial circles. Within hours, investors' phones began lighting up with frantic messages and breaking news alerts. The office was sealed. Computers were seized. Servers were imaged. Forensic accountants began reconstructing a decade of transactions. What they uncovered was staggering. Billions in reported portfolio value had never existed. The operation had relied entirely on recycled capital, meticulously timed transfers, and falsified statements. There were no hidden offshore funds generating secret profits. No proprietary trading engine humming in the background. Just layers upon layers of fabricated performance history designed to withstand casual scrutiny, but not a coordinated federal investigation. As the case unfolded, comparisons inevitably surfaced to infamous financial frauds of the past, particularly the massive Ponzi scheme orchestrated by Bernie Madoff. While Ryan's operation was smaller in scale, the psychological architecture was strikingly similar: consistency over exaggeration, exclusivity over publicity, and confidence over complexity. Analysts noted that his greatest weapon had not been technology, but emotional calibration. He understood exactly how much hope to sell without triggering disbelief. He engineered trust as carefully as he engineered spreadsheets. During interrogation, Ryan remained composed. He did not immediately confess, nor did he aggressively deny the allegations. Instead, he spoke in abstractions about market inefficiencies and misunderstood strategies. But confronted with time-stamped edits, transaction voids, and recorded contradictions, the narrative unraveled. The illusion required constant maintenance. Once exposed to light, it collapsed rapidly. Eventually, faced with overwhelming documentation, his defense shifted from denial to mitigation. It was no longer about proving innocence, it was about reducing consequences. The trial drew intense attention from financial media. Prosecutors laid out a clear chronological narrative: the fabricated algorithm, the falsified reports, the circular fund transfers. Victim statements filled the courtroom with emotional weight. Retirements had been delayed. College funds erased. Small businesses destabilized. Some investors admitted they ignored early warning signs because the returns felt reassuring during volatile years. The courtroom became more than a legal arena. It became a mirror reflecting the dangerous intersection of trust and ambition. Ryan's defense team argued that market downturns had pressured him into temporary misrepresentations that spiraled out of control. They described him not as a mastermind criminal, but as an overconfident strategist who believed he could eventually correct the imbalance. Yet prosecutors dismantled that narrative by showing the deception began long before any market crisis. The fraud was not reactive. It was foundational. Every gain reported from day one had been manufactured. When sentencing day arrived, the courtroom was silent. The judge emphasized not only the financial damage, but the calculated nature of the deception. Trust, the judge stated, is the currency upon which financial systems are built. Undermining it carries consequences beyond numbers on a ledger. Ryan was sentenced to decades in federal prison, along with orders for restitution that would take a lifetime to attempt to repay. The polished suits were replaced with a prison uniform. The confident presentations reduced to inmate identification numbers. In the months that followed, analysts and regulators examined how such a scheme persisted for so long. Stricter compliance measures were proposed. Investors became more cautious. Financial advisors cited the case as a warning. Steady returns without volatility may signal manipulation rather than mastery. Workshops referenced it as a modern lesson in due diligence. The story became part of the broader conversation about transparency in an increasingly complex financial world. Yet the most haunting element of the story is not the scale of the fraud, nor the length of the sentence. It is how ordinary it all appeared while it was happening. There were no dramatic warning sirens. No obvious red flags waving in bright color. Just confidence, consistency, and carefully constructed reports. Ryan Coleman did not hack the system. He studied it and then studied the people inside it. And in the end, it was not technology or mathematics that brought him down. It was the simple truth that illusions, no matter how refined, cannot survive sustained scrutiny forever. Prison did not begin with violence or chaos. It began with silence. When Ryan entered a federal correctional facility in upstate New York, the noise of trading floors and luxury hotels was replaced by controlled routines in institutional walls. For the first time in over a decade, there were no emails demanding performance updates, no investors seeking reassurance, no spreadsheets to adjust before midnight. Just time. Endless, uninterrupted time. The confidence that once filled boardrooms now had no audience. And without an audience, performance loses purpose. The man who engineered financial illusions was now reduced to reflection. Meanwhile, outside prison walls, the financial damage continued unfolding. Court-appointed trustees began the long process of asset recovery. Properties were liquidated. Luxury watches auctioned. Bank accounts frozen. But the math was unforgiving. Much of the capital had been redistributed over the years, spent or reinvested by early participants who unknowingly benefited from recycled funds. Recovering losses in a Ponzi structure is never clean. It becomes a puzzle of who withdrew what and when. Some former investors were even asked to return false profits they had unknowingly received, creating a second wave of financial distress. Media coverage intensified as analysts dissected how such a scheme operated for so long without immediate detection. Financial commentators compared structural weaknesses in oversight, though they stopped short of calling it systemic failure. The discussion shifted toward investor psychology. Why do intelligent, experienced individuals suspend skepticism in the presence of consistent returns? Why does exclusivity increase perceived legitimacy? Ryan's case became a life study in behavioral finance, proof that emotion often overrides mathematics. In interviews conducted years later, several victims admitted the warning signs had been visible. Performance charts that were too smooth. Reports that arrived with uncanny punctuality. Explanations that sounded sophisticated but resisted deeper questioning. Yet many confessed they feared appearing ignorant if they challenged him. Ryan cultivated an atmosphere where doubt felt unsophisticated. In doing so, he weaponized social pressure, not just greed. Inside prison, Ryan reportedly began assisting other inmates with financial literacy tutoring. The irony was unmistakable. The same analytical skills once used to fabricate trading data were now used to explain compound interest and retirement planning. Whether this shift reflected remorse or simply adaptation remains unclear. Those who interacted with him described him as calm, articulate, and emotionally reserved, much like the persona he projected in boardrooms years earlier. Regulatory agencies introduced tighter reporting standards for mid-sized private investment firms. Enhanced auditing requirements were proposed, including independent third-party verification of algorithmic trading claims. The case reinforced a critical lesson: complexity must be transparent, not theatrical. Financial technology could no longer rely solely on self-reported performance metrics without verification trails. Ryan's fabricated AI-driven model indirectly accelerated scrutiny on legitimate fintech innovation. Universities and business schools incorporated the case into ethics courses. Professors highlighted not only the fraud mechanics but the moral turning points along the timeline. At what moment did ambition become deception? Was there a point where Ryan could have stopped without catastrophic fallout? Students debated whether financial fraudsters are driven by desperation, ego, or gradual moral erosion. The answers were never unanimous. For many victims, the consequences extended beyond money. Trust in institutions eroded. Some withdrew permanently from markets, choosing conservative savings over investment risk. Others rebuilt slowly, guided by stricter due diligence and diversified strategies. A few admitted that the experience reshaped their understanding of wealth itself, shifting focus from aggressive growth to sustainable stability. Years into his sentence, Ryan filed appeals challenging aspects of his conviction, arguing procedural overreach and sentencing severity. Most were denied. The legal system, methodical and deliberate, moved forward without spectacle. His name gradually faded from headlines, replaced by newer scandals and fresher crises. Public memory in financial markets is notoriously short. Yet for those directly affected, the story remained permanent. In the end, Ryan's greatest illusion was not the fake algorithm or the manufactured returns. It was the belief that control could be permanent. Financial systems fluctuate. Markets correct. And deception, no matter how sophisticated, accumulates pressure over time. Axis 4 is not about prison walls or courtrooms, it is about consequence. The quiet, methodical unraveling that follows unchecked ambition. Because in finance, as in life, numbers can be manipulated temporarily, but reality always reconciles the balance. 2 years after Ryan Coleman disappeared from headlines, most of the financial world had moved on. Markets recovered. New startups emerged. Fresh scandals replaced old ones. But in Washington, D.C., an investigative journalist named Elena Vargas believed the story was unfinished. While reviewing archived court documents for an unrelated piece, she noticed something subtle but unsettling. Several large wire transfers referenced in preliminary filings were never fully explained during trial. They were acknowledged, categorized, and then quietly absorbed into broader summaries. For most readers, they were insignificant footnotes. For Elena, they were loose threads. Elena worked for a respected financial publication and had built a reputation for meticulous long-form investigations. She wasn't interested in sensationalism. She wanted structured timelines, documentation, patterns. When she requested access to expanded bankruptcy trustee reports, she discovered that certain offshore transfers had been flagged but not aggressively pursued. The official explanation cited insufficient jurisdictional leverage. That answer satisfied regulators. It did not satisfy her. Money rarely disappears without friction. It moves, it transforms, it resurfaces. Tracing the transfers led her to shell corporations registered in the Caribbean and later linked to holding entities in Cyprus. The corporate structures were layered but not invisible. What puzzled her was timing. Some of these entities were established months before the first investor complaint was filed. That suggested foresight, not panic. If Ryan had prepared exit channels long before scrutiny intensified, perhaps the narrative of a spiraling scheme was incomplete. Elena filed formal information requests and contacted former compliance officers who had briefly reviewed Ryan's firm during its expansion phase. One former auditor, speaking anonymously, admitted there had been internal discomfort about the opacity of certain algorithmic claims, but the firm's external documentation appeared legally sufficient at the time. No definitive red flags, just unease. Unease, Elena knew, is often the earliest detectable signal of concealed truth. Her breakthrough came unexpectedly. A mid-level financial consultant reached out after reading one of her preliminary articles. He claimed that several years before the arrest, Ryan had explored raising capital for a separate private fund that was never publicly disclosed. The pitch materials, he said, referenced international diversification strategies unrelated to the main investment product. The consultant declined involvement and thought little of it until the arrest years later. If such a parallel fund existed, it might explain the unexplained transfers. Elena reconstructed the timeline meticulously. Public investor funds flowed in predictable cycles. But the offshore wires appeared irregular, detached from normal payout patterns. That separation hinted at something different from the Ponzi structure described in court. Perhaps a reserve. Perhaps a contingency. Or perhaps a secondary operation entirely. She traveled to Boston to interview one of Ryan's earliest investors, a retired executive who had withdrawn profits years before the collapse. During their conversation, he mentioned an exclusive dinner where Ryan spoke more candidly than usual. According to him, Ryan once said, "The real money isn't in the model. It's in positioning before anyone realizes the model isn't the product." At the time, it sounded philosophical. Now it sounded strategic. When Elena requested comment from federal authorities, the response was measured. The Federal Bureau of Investigation confirmed that all prosecutable elements of the case had been addressed at trial. They declined to comment on speculative extensions beyond documented charges. It was neither confirmation nor denial. Just procedural closure. Her investigation culminated in a long-form exposé suggesting that while the Ponzi scheme had been dismantled, the possibility remained that a portion of capital had been repositioned through early offshore structuring beyond the scope of courtroom focus. She stopped short of accusing anyone of ongoing criminal conduct. Instead, she posed a more unsettling question: was Ryan merely sustaining an illusion or quietly building an escape framework from the very beginning? The article reignited public debate. Some dismissed it as retrospective intrigue. Others wondered whether financial crimes are ever fully mapped, or simply contained once visible damage is controlled. From his prison cell, Ryan declined interview requests. No clarification. No denial. Just silence. And in financial history, silence often echoes louder than confession. Axis 5 leaves us not with certainty, but with the uncomfortable possibility that even when a fraud collapses, parts of the architecture may remain standing, hidden in jurisdictions where scrutiny fades and memory shortens. Long before Elena's article reignited public interest, there had been a detail buried deep in early investigative files, a recurring encrypted email address that never belonged directly to Ryan. It appeared briefly in internal correspondence recovered from archived servers, then vanished. At first glance, it seemed like a disposable technical contact used during platform setup. But digital forensic notes indicated something unusual. Several key performance reports had been edited from two separate IP environments. One traced back to Ryan's known locations in New York City. The other originated from a rotating network that masked consistent geographic identity. That second signal was never fully explained in court. Financial fraud at Ryan's scale required discipline, but not necessarily partnership. Still, some structural choices suggested strategic collaboration. The offshore entities Elena traced in Cyprus were registered through a boutique advisory firm specializing in asset shielding for high-net-worth clients. Records showed remote authorization signatures legally valid, but procedurally detached. Ryan could have orchestrated this alone. Yet the timing aligned too precisely with certain algorithm updates that never technically existed. It implied synchronized planning. A former systems contractor, briefly hired during the firm's early expansion phase, later recalled being asked to configure secure cloud redundancy for proprietary trading logic. He never saw the algorithm itself. He was simply instructed to create layered access privileges, including one administrator profile he was told never to question. Payment for the contract arrived not from Ryan's company account, but from an external consultancy registered in Delaware. The contractor assumed it was normal corporate structuring. Years later, the memory unsettled him. Elena revisited archived call logs disclosed during trial. While most investor communication followed predictable patterns, there were recurring late-night calls to a prepaid international number during periods of financial strain. The frequency increased just before major capital shifts. Investigators had categorized the calls as unverified and unrelated due to insufficient subscriber data. But patterns matter. And patterns rarely form without coordination. Inside federal prison, Ryan maintained minimal contact with the outside world. He declined media interviews, avoided written correspondence beyond immediate family, and refrained from public commentary about his conviction. Yet one correctional officer later described an unusual habit. Ryan regularly requested access to financial newspapers, not to follow markets, but to track regulatory updates in fintech compliance. It suggested continued strategic awareness. Awareness of what? No one could say. Speculation intensified when a small but sophisticated hedge fund launched quietly in Miami 3 years after Ryan's conviction. Its marketing emphasized volatility-neutral precision modeling and consistent mid-range returns. The performance graphs displayed an oddly familiar smoothness. There was no direct evidence linking the fund to Ryan. Its founders had clean professional histories. Yet structural language in its pitch materials mirrored phrasing once used in Ryan's archived presentations, subtle, but striking. The Federal Bureau of Investigation declined to reopen the case without material evidence. Officially, the matter remained closed. Prosecutable elements had been resolved. Restitution channels were active. From a legal standpoint, ambiguity is not grounds for action. But ambiguity is fertile ground for narrative and sometimes for continuation. Financial historians often debate whether large-scale frauds are products of singular personalities or distributed intelligence. Could Ryan have engineered every structural safeguard alone? Possibly. But complex deception benefits from division of knowledge. One architect designs illusion, another designs insulation. If a shadow partner existed, their greatest strength would have been invisibility, never appearing in filings, never speaking publicly, never touching investor funds directly. Elena's final follow-up article did not accuse. It questioned. She outlined the dual IP traces, the offshore synchrony, the unidentified administrator credentials, and the emergence of stylistically similar investment language years later. Her conclusion was restrained. Financial crimes often end with conviction. Financial strategies do not. The line between them depends on intent, and intent is rarely archived. Axis 6 does not prove a hidden accomplice. It exposes structural silence. Whether Ryan acted alone or alongside an unseen strategist may never be definitively answered. But one truth remains constant: in financial systems built on trust and abstraction, the most dangerous participants are not always those who stand in the spotlight. Sometimes, the real architect never signs a single document and never needs to. In the controlled stillness of federal prison in New York, routine replaced adrenaline. Wake-up calls, scheduled meals, limited movement repetition stripped life down to structure. For most inmates, routine is suffocating. For Ryan, it became analytical space. Without investors to reassure or spreadsheets to manipulate, he was left alone with memory. Psychologists often note that high-functioning financial fraudsters share a particular trait: they do not initially perceive themselves as criminals. They perceive themselves as strategic outliers, individuals temporarily bending rules in pursuit of eventual correction. The question was never whether Ryan understood what he did. The question was whether he reframed it internally as necessary. Court-appointed behavioral evaluators described him as cognitively advanced, emotionally regulated, and unusually compartmentalized. Compartmentalization is a powerful psychological defense. It allows conflicting realities to coexist without internal collapse. In one mental box, Ryan was a disciplined financial strategist. In another, he was simply managing liquidity imbalances. The word fraud rarely appeared in his own descriptions during interviews. Instead, he used phrases like structural delay and capital timing misalignment. Language, even internally, reshapes moral perception. Experts studying large-scale deception often reference cases like Bernie Madoff when analyzing cognitive drift, the gradual normalization of misconduct. Rarely does a massive fraud begin with the intention of building a decade-long lie. More often, it begins with a small distortion justified by confidence in future recovery. A missed trade becomes a temporary adjustment. An adjustment becomes a fabricated report. Once the first artificial number is entered, the psychological barrier weakens. From there, maintenance replaces morality. Ryan's early colleagues recalled that he thrived under intellectual challenge. He disliked randomness. Markets fascinated him not because of profit alone, but because of pattern recognition. When volatility disrupted predictability, it reportedly frustrated him. Some behavioral analysts speculate that his fabricated algorithm was not just a tool for deception, but an attempt to impose artificial order on chaotic systems. In a paradoxical sense, the fake model gave him control the real market never could. During one closed-door psychological session, he was reportedly asked a direct question: "At what point did you know you wouldn't be able to fix it?" He paused for an extended time before responding. According to notes later summarized in legal documents, he answered, "When growth became the only solution." That statement revealed a critical shift. The scheme no longer aimed at correction. It required expansion to survive. Growth was no longer success, it was oxygen. Financial fraud at this level often creates a feedback loop between admiration and identity. Investors praised Ryan as disciplined, visionary, even brilliant during volatile years. That admiration reinforced his self-concept. To confess failure would not only expose deception, it would dismantle the identity built around being exceptional. Psychologists call this identity fusion, where personal worth becomes inseparable from external validation. Protecting the illusion becomes equivalent to protecting the self. Interestingly, prison stripped away audience reinforcement. Without investors or media narratives, Ryan's cognitive framework faced friction. Fellow inmates reportedly saw him as composed but distant. He engaged in analytical conversations, avoided emotional vulnerability, and rarely discussed the case in personal terms. When asked whether he regretted the damage, he reportedly responded, "Regret is inefficient unless it produces adjustment." Even remorse, it seemed, was processed through strategic language. Elena, the journalist who had followed the story beyond conviction, once wrote that Ryan's greatest manipulation may not have been financial, it may have been psychological self-editing. If a person can redefine harm as miscalculation, and deception as delay, internal conflict decreases. The human mind is remarkably adaptable when survival, social or literal, is at stake. Behavioral economists studying the case later described it as a convergence of ego, cognitive bias, and incremental rationalization. Overconfidence bias allowed Ryan to believe he could eventually outmaneuver exposure. Optimism bias convinced him markets would eventually align in his favor. And sunk cost fallacy ensured that once too much had been fabricated, stopping would feel more catastrophic than continuing. Axis 7 reveals something more unsettling than hidden partners or offshore accounts. It reveals that the most dangerous financial frauds may not require dramatic villainy. They require intelligence without ethical anchoring, confidence without correction, and growth without boundaries. Ryan did not wake up one morning deciding to destroy livelihoods. He built a narrative where destruction was an unintended byproduct of brilliance under pressure. And in that narrative, carefully constructed, internally rehearsed, he remained not a criminal, but the misunderstood architect of a system that simply expanded beyond control. 3 years into his sentence, Ryan Coleman's routine in federal prison in New York was abruptly interrupted. During a routine audit of prison property, guards discovered a small, unassuming notebook tucked inside a legal pad in Ryan's cell. At first glance, it appeared mundane: personal notes, dates, and sketches. But upon closer inspection, it was a coded financial ledger. Spreadsheets transcribed in ink, cross-referenced with cryptic symbols and shorthand, suggested a record of transactions that had never appeared in court filings. The numbers aligned suspiciously with offshore transfers previously flagged but never fully traced. The prison administration quickly contacted federal authorities. Analysts tasked with decoding the ledger described it as elegant, deliberate, and unnervingly precise. Each entry appeared to document movements of funds through shell companies in multiple countries. Some transactions dated back to the early stages of Ryan's firm, years before the first investor complaints. Others continued well into the period that had been considered fully liquidated in official accounts. If decoded correctly, the ledger hinted that part of Ryan's wealth had never been recovered. The ledger was written in a hybrid system, a combination of numerical shorthand, proprietary symbols, and letter codes. Financial experts noted that each symbol corresponded to specific accounts, currencies, and investor categories. Unlike spreadsheets, it was fully analog, eliminating the digital footprints that had facilitated his prior detection. Ryan had constructed an entirely parallel record system, a secret map of capital invisible to auditors and investigators at the time. Its very existence suggested foresight and meticulous planning beyond what had been publicly assumed. Elena Vargas, still following the story, obtained partial access to the notebook under Freedom of Information requests. She compared the ledger's early entries with publicly available transaction reports. Patterns emerged: subtle mismatches in dates, amounts, and account identifiers. It appeared Ryan had anticipated regulatory scrutiny, maintaining dual tracks, one visible and compliant, the other hidden and flexible. Every calculated delay, every structured payout now had context. What regulators saw in court was only part of a far larger and more intricate design. Prison psychologists speculated that Ryan maintained the ledger for mental security as much as financial purpose. Writing numbers and codes may have recreated a sense of control, a familiar structure in the absence of his professional environment. Yet the precision and scale suggested more than habit. The notebook could potentially expose hidden funds or guide investigators toward assets never previously accounted for. The question became, did Ryan intend for it to be discovered eventually, Or had he underestimated the diligence of prison audits? Inside the ledger, one entry stood out, a series of encrypted coordinates and account numbers tied to a mysterious entity labeled Project Horizon. Analysts quickly realized it did not correspond to any known shell company or registered fund. Its timeline overlapped with offshore transfers Elena had previously traced, but the ledger implied continued activity beyond Ryan's arrest. Whether Project Horizon was a contingency plan, a hidden partner operation, or simply a record of potential investment moves remained unknown. Yet its existence reignited the possibility that Ryan's influence extended far beyond the prison walls. Federal investigators reopened portions of the case, cautiously and discreetly. They tracked correspondence between the ledger entries and existing accounts in Cyprus, the Caribbean, and certain European financial hubs. Some funds were frozen or recovered, but others had been moved repeatedly through complex chains, making retrieval nearly impossible. For the first time, a sense of unfinished business emerged. The conviction had neutralized Ryan, but the structure of his wealth, meticulously shielded, still whispered potential loopholes. Within the prison, Ryan reportedly remained composed despite the renewed scrutiny. Guards and psychologists observed a quiet detachment. He did not protest the investigation. He did not attempt to destroy the notebook. If anything, he appeared resigned yet calculated, as though revealing the ledger at the right moment could create a secondary narrative, one in which he controlled the final impression of his legacy. It was strategy even in confinement, influence without mobility, authority without presence. Elena published her report with careful phrasing, emphasizing that the ledger's contents suggested complexity, foresight, and a sophistication previously unappreciated. She refrained from definitive claims about missing funds or hidden accomplices but implied that the story of Ryan Coleman was incomplete. The financial world reacted with fascination and trepidation. Even years after the collapse, a single notebook had reignited speculation about resilience, planning, and the hidden layers of human ingenuity and greed. Months after the discovery of the ledger, federal investigators intensified their focus on Project Horizon. Analysts pored over Ryan Coleman's meticulously coded entries, tracing international wire transfers, shell corporations, and cryptic account identifiers. Every symbol, every date, every annotation was cross-referenced with financial intelligence databases. For the first time, the scope of what had been hidden began to emerge. It wasn't just residual wealth, it was an entire subnetwork of funds strategically shielded from detection, some of it moving through jurisdictions with minimal reporting requirements. The complexity stunned even veteran investigators. Elena Vargas received early access to portions of the decoded ledger under strict legal protocols. She noticed an uncanny pattern. Funds that appeared lost or neutralized years ago had in some cases been redirected into dormant accounts, only to be reactivated when market conditions favored discretion and low visibility. The movement suggested premeditation far beyond Ryan's initial scheme. Project Horizon, she realized, might have been designed not only to protect capital but to serve as a potential escape mechanism, an invisible lifeline beyond conviction and imprisonment. Federal authorities faced a challenge. The ledger's sophistication meant any misstep could result in irretrievable losses or legal complications. Many accounts were tied to legitimate intermediaries and high-net-worth clients who had no direct knowledge of Ryan's scheme. Freezing or reclaiming these assets required careful coordination across international banking regulations. Each move had to be surgical. A single miscalculation could spark lawsuits or unintended collateral damage, forcing investigators to operate at the intersection of law, finance, and forensic precision. A breakthrough occurred when analysts traced a series of interlinked transactions between shell entities in Cyprus, the Caribbean, and Hong Kong. The funds flowed through multiple accounts, yet the net result consistently matched ledger predictions. It confirmed that Ryan had constructed a fully functioning, self-sustaining subnetwork that could theoretically operate independently of him. The revelation caused unease among prosecutors. The scale of premeditation was far greater than anticipated. Ryan's conviction had neutralized his physical freedom, but not the invisible architecture of his wealth. Meanwhile, Elena conducted interviews with former investors and minor collaborators. Many described moments of unexplained returns or account adjustments that now, in retrospect, hinted at hidden management. Patterns once dismissed as luck or market anomalies now aligned with Project Horizon's operational timeline. Her reporting emphasized that Ryan had anticipated scrutiny and designed contingencies, ensuring the collapse of his visible firm would not completely destroy the hidden structure. It was the ultimate test of strategic foresight. Inside prison, Ryan reportedly became aware of the renewed investigation. Observers noted a calm detachment in his demeanor, almost as if he had predicted this outcome decades earlier. He requested more access to financial newspapers and analytical reports, not to manipulate, but to track the system he had built in abstraction. Psychologists speculated that his cognitive focus on Project Horizon was less about control and more about intellectual engagement. Maintaining oversight of a complex system, even from behind bars, fulfilled the same psychological need that constructing the original scheme had. Investigators finally uncovered evidence suggesting that at least one trusted intermediary had operated in tandem with Ryan. This person, previously overlooked, managed portions of offshore accounts and ensured that certain transactions remained invisible to regulatory tracking. While the accomplice's identity remained officially confidential, the implication was clear: Ryan's success had relied not only on personal genius but on calculated collaboration. Project Horizon was not just a ledger, it was a living, coordinated network capable of surviving its creator's confinement. As legal teams coordinated international asset freezes, media coverage intensified. Headlines emphasized that financial crimes often leave echoes long after convictions. Analysts debated the ethical and practical implications. Should authorities focus solely on reclaiming lost capital, or attempt to dismantle the operational knowledge embedded in the system itself? Project Horizon demonstrated that financial ingenuity, even when criminal, can produce structures resilient to conventional oversight. The saga transcended one man, becoming a case study in the intersection of law, psychology, and global finance. Elena's final investigative piece on Project Horizon underscored the broader lesson: transparency and oversight are essential not only for justice but for systemic stability. She avoided sensationalism, presenting the evidence methodically: the ledger, offshore activity, and calculated contingencies. She highlighted the moral ambiguity inherent in such schemes: brilliance intertwined with deception, foresight with criminality. Ryan Coleman's legacy, she concluded, was not merely a cautionary tale of fraud, but a study of how intelligence and ambition, unanchored by ethics, can shape systems long after the architect is removed. Axis 9 closes on a cinematic note. Project Horizon, though partially neutralized, remained a testament to the enduring consequences of sophisticated deception. Ryan Coleman, imprisoned yet mentally engaged with the system he had built, had shown that genius paired with meticulous planning can leave traces that survive courts, convictions, and public scrutiny. In finance, as in life, actions ripple far beyond immediate consequences. Hidden structures endure, waiting for discovery, and sometimes, no single conviction can fully reconcile the balance between ingenuity and law. Years had passed since Ryan Coleman's conviction. Prison routines had become a permanent rhythm, yet his influence, hidden and abstract, persisted beyond the steel walls of New York. Project Horizon, though partially dismantled by international cooperation and asset freezes, continued to intrigue investigators, journalists, and financial analysts. Its traces were subtle dormant accounts, offshore transfers, coded entries, but the knowledge of its architecture remained alive in legal archives and investigative files. Ryan had created a system that, in many ways, outlived its operator, a quiet testament to the enduring power of strategic intelligence. Elena Vargas published her final in-depth exposé, meticulously piecing together the narrative from court transcripts, the hidden ledger, and multiple interviews. She emphasized not only the scale of the fraud but the human ingenuity behind it. Ryan was portrayed as a man whose intellect and ambition had outpaced ethics, a person capable of constructing a multi-year illusion that fooled investors, regulators, and even parts of the federal system. Her reporting concluded that while justice had been served legally, the story highlighted vulnerabilities in financial oversight and human perception that remained relevant today. Inside the prison, Ryan's life was one of controlled routine and intellectual engagement. He requested continued access to financial publications and historical market data, not to rebuild the scheme, but to study its consequences. Psychologists noted a mixture of detachment and fascination. He analyzed not only the financial impact but the psychological patterns of investors, regulators, and even journalists who had traced his activities. For Ryan, Project Horizon had transformed from a tool of deception into a complex mental model, a permanent playground for strategic thought. Federal authorities, meanwhile, completed the bulk of asset recovery. Some offshore accounts were frozen, some capital redirected to restitution funds, but other portions had vanished into opaque jurisdictions or had been legally absorbed by third parties. This partial recovery became an enduring lesson. Even with meticulous investigation and legal power, intelligence and planning can leave residual structures that cannot be fully unraveled. Ryan's architecture had been too sophisticated, too prescient, to be entirely neutralized. Public fascination remained intense. Documentaries, podcasts, and financial ethics courses analyzed his methods. Professors cited Ryan as an example of how cognitive bias, compartmentalization, and strategic foresight intersect in high-stakes environments. Students debated whether intelligence without ethics inevitably produces harm, or whether the system itself, one that rewards trust, compliance, and perceived competence, allows such individuals to flourish. Ryan's story became a cautionary tale not of villainy alone, but of systemic vulnerability and human susceptibility. Psychologists studying Ryan's behavior concluded that his genius had always been intertwined with control over perception, over information, and ultimately over reality itself. From the boardroom to the ledger notebook in prison, he demonstrated that power lies not only in action but in the orchestration of belief. Investors, regulators, and even the media had been manipulated, not by force, but by carefully crafted signals, a testament to how intellect and charisma can shape perception more effectively than coercion. Elena's final note emphasized that the ledger, Project Horizon, and Ryan's mental strategies were not simply criminal artifacts, they were lessons in psychology, ethics, and vigilance. Financial structures, no matter how regulated, remain susceptible to subtle manipulation. Trust, once misapplied, can propagate errors far beyond immediate actors. Ryan Coleman's life illustrated that even when consequences are imposed, the ripple effects of intelligence coupled with ambition can endure for decades. In the quiet halls of the prison, Ryan reportedly reflected on his past not with regret, but with calculation. He recognized the duality of his legacy, personal downfall, yet intellectual triumph and complexity. The illusion had collapsed publicly, but its architecture persisted privately. And in that persistence, he found a kind of control, the same control that had driven him to construct Project Horizon in the first place. It was a paradoxical freedom, contained within confinement. The saga closed for the world, but not entirely for history. Regulators updated compliance measures. Journalists archived detailed investigations. Investors recalibrated skepticism. And the story of Ryan Coleman, the man who fooled Wall Street and built a hidden empire from spreadsheets, offshore entities, and psychological mastery, became a permanent lesson. Brilliance without ethical grounding can outlast even the most thorough justice, leaving behind shadows that linger in systems, minds, and archives. Within prison, Ryan reportedly remained detached yet intellectually engaged. He requested access to historical financial reports and regulatory updates, studying market behavior indirectly connected to his former operations. Psychologists speculated that his attention to residual patterns was a form of cognitive habit, a combination of curiosity, pride, and the need to mentally preserve the architecture he had built. Project Horizon had become more than a tool of deception, it was a mental model he could explore even in confinement, shaping his perception of control and influence. Families affected by Ryan's fraud experienced long-term consequences beyond money. Retirement plans were delayed or reduced. Trust in financial institutions eroded, sometimes permanently. Some investors withdrew entirely from markets, adopting extreme caution in future ventures. Yet paradoxically, some of his victims became advocates for transparency, accountability, and education, turning personal loss into systemic improvement. Ryan's impact extended into social and cultural dimensions, illustrating that financial deception creates human consequences that persist far longer than legal timelines. As decades passed, Ryan's story became mythologized in financial communities not as mere crime, but as legend. Project Horizon, the ledger, and his psychological methods became shorthand for sophisticated, resilient deception. Young analysts were warned, even small anomalies in reporting can signal profound hidden activity. Ryan Coleman's life was analyzed not only as a criminal case but as a template for understanding how intelligence, psychology, and ambition intersect to produce enduring, real-world consequences. Academic institutions incorporated his story into ethics and finance curricula worldwide. Business schools dissected the case not simply as criminal behavior but as a study in human cognition, trust manipulation, and systemic vulnerability. Professors emphasized lessons in behavioral finance, how overconfidence bias, sunk cost fallacy, and optimism bias allowed intelligent investors to suspend skepticism. Ryan Coleman became a central figure in case studies exploring how emotional perception can outweigh numerical rationality, leaving a lasting imprint on generations of future financial professionals. Financial journalists continued to reference Ryan's story as a cautionary tale. Podcasts, documentaries, and investigative reports detailed Project Horizon and the Hidden Ledger, emphasizing subtle lessons. Sophistication in fraud often hides in routine, and brilliance without ethics can outlive legal consequences. Elena Vargas' follow-up investigations maintained public interest, demonstrating that fraud is rarely isolated to one moment or individual. Instead, its echoes shape behavior, regulation, and cultural understanding of risk and trust. Meanwhile, minor accounts linked to Project Horizon occasionally resurfaced, revealing small but significant capital flows that regulators could not entirely trace. These remnants became a subject of speculation in financial media. Could the network Ryan had built continue operating in some minimal form? While no evidence indicated active malfeasance, the mere potential of hidden infrastructure created unease. Analysts emphasized that sophisticated financial systems are never entirely static and that patterns of concealment often outlast their architects.